It's a Believe in Texans podcast brought to you by FanDuel. And today, Nick Caserio was doing his normal pre-draft press conference, but he also added assistant GMs Chris Blanco and James Lipford. Made it interesting, and I got some good answers from both of those guys. Nothing they said today will knock me off of my confidence that we're over on FanDuel. You can get the Texans at 9.5 wins for the season win total. I'm going over on that. So it would have to be something pretty drastic for me to knock me off of that at that point. But they talked about CJ Stroud picking up his extension, a few things they look for in draft prospects, how Cole Popovich may shape the draft differently than how it had been before, answered questions about NIL and a whole bunch of other things. These are a few of my favorite answers from the day. Lots of good answers today. I liked having Caserio up there with those other two guys. I think maybe some of the answers were a little bit shorter and more concise. Not saying anything about anything, but we'll leave it at that. I'm going to start off with the CJ Stroud question, just because we have to talk about CJ Stroud at least once. It's the law, damn it. Caserio asked about picking up the fifth-year option on CJ Stroud and what that means for him moving forward.
Earlier in the offseason, you were very clear C.J. Stroud's the quarterback for this team. Since then, you guys have picked up the fifth-year option, putting him under contract for 2027. How does that affect his future with this team, having picked up that fifth-year option?
Yeah, I don't really think it affects his future. I mean, he's our quarterback. We've said that from the beginning. D'Amico and I both said it. So, I mean, I think that was really more of a procedural thing. I mean, I don't want to say it was a no-brainer, but it was kind of a no-brainer. So, glad he's here. Again, it's more part of the process. I mean, so we're excited about his off season. I think he's had a good approach, had a good attitude here. I think he's put a lot of work in, from, I'd say, March and April. So excited to have him around here in the spring, and I'm excited to keep moving forward.
Yeah, he scoffed at that. And, he's correct. And Cody had to ask that question at some point. It's more of a formality. It would be a much, much, much bigger story if they didn't pick up the fifth-year option. I know sometimes people get confused about the difference between the extension and picking up the fifth-year option. All the fifth-year option does is it guarantees CJ's salary in 2027 for $26 million, which is a relative bargain for a starting quarterback these days. But it gives the Texans that one more year of leverage to lock him in, and whether or not they extend him will be a topic of conversation once we get tired of talking about the draft. So you've got the draft, you've got post-draft, you got any little transactions that happen after that. And then there's a 2-month swath of open space where all kinds of bogus reports and speculation will come out about whether or not they extend CJ Stroud. So that's a topic for another day. This one I found very interesting. And Cole Popovich is now entering his second year as the offensive line coach instead of just being an assistant offensive line coach. And presumably he's going to be a part of the scouting process and have a larger voice than he did back when he was the assistant offensive line coach. Last year, Ariante Ursary ends up, I think, being a good pick for the Texans. So Cole Popovich would have had a lot more input into that, presumably, than he would have had before that. So far, so good. And Caserio was asked about just the Popovich dynamic. He didn't say anything specifically about Popovich necessarily, but it is a really interesting dynamic of how offensive line coaches can get involved with the scouting process in a way that maybe scouts can't with other people.
Just generally speaking, the offensive line, it's probably one of the, I don't want to say one of the harder positions to evaluate. And I think a lot of times, and this is where you can use multiple checks and balances. So, look, everybody watches the tape. A lot of the college systems are the college systems. A lot of the things that these players are going to be asked to do, it's probably going to be a little bit different. What you see on tape, the one thing, not just the Houston Texans, but league-wide, there's probably some benefit to the individual player workouts because you might be able to see something in a workout. You're not sure if he really has it or you didn't see him do it on tape, that maybe put him through the paces and say, you know what, he actually does this better than maybe we thought. And it's either a technique flaw, it's a body position flaw, or his ability to take coaching. I think that position, there's a certain level of instinctiveness, certain level of awareness, certain level of toughness, and to be able to take coaching and apply coaching, I would say it's a pretty nuanced position. Look, in the end, you got to be smart, you got to be tough, you got to be physical, you got to be competitive. Like I would say those are some non-negotiables, and then there's some technique things that either a coach is going to emphasize or that you're going to focus on within your system. And then I would say to a certain extent, you have to be able to extrapolate whether or not the player is going to be able to handle it or not.
So before Mike Vrabel found himself in his current ordeal, the biggest thing that was, I guess, viral with him this offseason was when he was working out with Max Al-Shaair, the offensive line prospect, and Vrabel was kind of hand fighting with him, putting him through some drills. And you don't usually see that with head coaches doing that as much, but you will see it with offensive linemen and defensive linemen, sometimes doing that against assistant coaches or scouts. And it really is, it's the closest thing to the way it is in wrestling, where in wrestling, a coach, the younger coaches at least, really love to get down and just work with a guy and just feel how he responds to different things. And you can start to pick up the way a guy moves and like what his core strength is, where maybe he can fix some things. A lot of times there's some coaching that goes on in that. A good coach will say, hey, if you drop your leg back a little bit further. And it's really cool, and I love it. Tim Crumry, the old defensive tackle from the Bengals, who a lot of you guys might remember, he broke his leg really badly in the Super Bowl one year. He came to work me out when I was a senior at Cornell, and I loved it. And he ended up liking me a lot, partly just because we did a lot of that close combat fighting, and he could kind of feel a certain stoutness or whatever it might be in me that doesn't necessarily show up on film. And I think that's where hopefully with Cole Popovich, who I'm very encouraged by, and I think he cleaned a lot of things up fundamentally, the more he can be involved and see guys up close and get a feel for guys like Ariante Ursary or some of the interior offensive line prospects this year especially, you can maybe see some things that you'd never pick up on film. So I like that. I think Cole Popovich is on the right track. James Lipford was asked about identifying and scouting Jaden Higgins. And I thought this was interesting because I think there's some non-negotiables with all their players. You just heard Caserio reference the non-negotiables with the offensive linemen. I think James Lipford, kind of in talking about Jaden Higgins, also paints a picture of what they're looking for in all their prospects.
That one. So with Jaden, he's an interesting player because he was only at Iowa State for a couple of years. Started his career at Eastern Kentucky, was an under-recruited player, Miami kid, more of a basketball player. And I'd say the thing that, talking to him specifically from our group was how he practiced. Not only how he was spoken about. Him and Jay Knoll were spoken about in very similar ways, different personalities, but the way they practiced, I would say, was one of the first things that stood out to us. He was very consistent. Honestly, had a lot of similarities to how Hutch practiced. So there's kind of a trend among those three guys. But he was unique, and we as a group felt that only really 2 years of Big 12 football. This wasn't a guy that had been in a Power 5 for 4 or 5 years. Was there some more upside with this guy? And then you combine that with his intelligence, his work ethic, the type of person that his parents raised. We felt like he'd be a good person out of our program. And, it's year one was good, and, hopefully more from him moving forward.
Yeah, the practice part. I mean, that's huge. Sean Pendergast and I talked about that on the morning show on Sports Radio 610, where, by the way, we'll have Nick Caserio Wednesday morning. I think it's 7:30 a.m. So if you want to tune in for even more Caserio and some follow-ups to some of the questions or some of the answers that he gave today, we'll be doing that on Wednesday morning. The non-negotiable, I think, is does this guy take practice seriously? Does he practice hard? And I know a lot of you watching or listening might be thinking, shouldn't that be a non-negotiable for everybody? Yes, it 100% should be. Not all coaches operate that way. A lot of coaches think, hey, you know what? We'll get him in, and maybe he's got to mature a little bit. We'll teach him the value of hard work and all of that. Man, that's easier said than done. I remember an old restaurant manager or a hotel manager who had said that we don't think that we're going to teach something that a kid's parents should have taught them. They want to try to hire people whose either parents raised them right the way or their mentor raised them the right way. They had good hard coaching. And that's why you see these themes sometimes with the Texans really liking guys that come out of certain programs. The current program that's in vogue with the Texans is Iowa State. Matt Campbell, of course, moved on to Penn State. So I would expect to start seeing more Penn State prospects filtering into the Texans as they continue to look at him as a guy that asks guys to practice a certain way. Xavier Hutchinson, no matter what his ceiling or floor is as a player, they really like the way he practiced. And with the guys that the Texans have drafted since D'Amico got here, Texans Jacob had a tweet yesterday that showed that the Texans had met with all of the guys they've taken in the first 3 rounds since D'Amico got here. They've either met with them at the combine, or they've met with them, or they've had a top 30 visit. They're allowed 30 prospects that they can bring into the facility. So that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean if they meet with those guys, they're going to draft them. But they have met with all of those guys. There are only 2 guys that they hadn't had a top 30 visit with. Jaden Higgins was one of them. I can't remember who the other one was. But I wonder if with Jaden Higgins, it was just a matter of getting so much positive word of mouth from people that they respect that they just felt like it was a slam dunk. So again, top 30 visits, sometimes they'll bring a guy in just to be sure that they don't like him, but they're also bringing guys in just to really check off all the boxes, be sure that they have a complete picture of the player. But sometimes they feel like they can tell already and they know what they're getting into. Texans right now are still favored to win the division at plus 155. The Jaguars are behind them. This is on FanDuel, of course. And the one thing to monitor with that is I don't think it'll change much. The Jaguars did barely anything in free agency. They don't have as many draft picks as they once did because the guy that they traded up so aggressively for, and Travis Hunter, they traded up aggressively because he was going to be a 2-way player. Looks like he's going to be mostly on defense this year. So, the time will tell whether that was a wise strategy or not. Caserio, if we move into Caserio, for you techies, or you non-techies like myself who are trying to figure out how to incorporate AI into our lives, Caserio's asked about whether they're using AI and to what extent.
Great question. I honestly, Chris is probably as versed on this as anyone. I mean, he spends a lot of time. I'll let him kind of talk about this. I think we've all I speak for myself, experimented with some of the tools, and there's different things that you can do, tools, models. Again, it's a data point, and maybe what it does. Again, I'm not very smart, but it seems like their models are built, you can take massive amounts of information and distill them down into a digestible amount, and maybe kind of guides your thought process and leads you in a direction that might be advantageous.
Yeah, and a couple things. Chris Blanco spoke on this a little bit later. I don't have his response. I'll probably do like 5 episodes just on this press conference. I think the biggest thing for scouts and conscientious personnel people is that they always want to know where their blind spots are. And especially if you think of a scout reading through, or a GM especially, reading through all these various reports. And then there's the element of, okay, I've seen this guy in person. I haven't seen that guy in person. Caserio's talked about this before. Sometimes you have a bias towards the guys you've seen in person. So I think for me personally, and then I think for especially in a scouting business like this, really being sure that you're seeing things through the same lens with all these different prospects and kind of systematically taking in the information from all your scouts and all those people and filtering it into a report that you're either taking the blinders off or putting the blinders on, whatever situation it might entail. The other part of it too is how a lot of teams are now using technology. I don't want to say AI because AI is involved with every app and computer model you're going to use now. But teams like the Rams, because there have been articles written about the Rams specifically, that really are moving way beyond the classic combine measurements to figure out if somebody's fast or not, and using the GPS tracking, using whatever video tools they have available to figure out, okay, how fast is a guy actually in game situations on the football field? How explosive is he? All of these things. Caserio is always real careful not to divulge too much. I would be really surprised if they're not using a lot of those things. And I think that when a guy like Kamari Lassiter, for instance, runs a slow 40, Caserio looks at that as an opportunity. Caserio told that to Sean and I when we interviewed him at the Combine earlier this year. That sometimes, a guy that you really like runs a slow 40, and you're kind of thinking, okay, well, all right, cool. Hopefully some teams out there, like the Raiders, for instance, might still be going by 40 times, more so than the more advanced stuff. And we also know from our scouts saying, he looks plenty fast when I watch him play football. That seems relevant. Does a guy get run past on the football field? No. and he's in the SEC. I don't care as much about him running a slow 40. You know, the Ravens, and I don't know how much technology the Ravens do because they've been doing this forever before there was GPS tracking or anything. The day Kyle Hamilton ran a slow 40 at the combine, I tweeted out, well, that sums it, that he's going to be a Raven. Lo and behold, a couple months later, boom, he goes to the Ravens. Texans could have had him. They traded back. Who'd they take? They took Kenny Green. Well, that's old stuff. We ain't talking about that stuff no more. Speaking of old people like myself, there's a knee-jerk response from the olds when it comes to the transfer portal and NIL that I had initially, but I've moved beyond it. I've moved beyond it for a couple of years. But, man, when you're looking at these guys between NIL and the transfer portal, how has it changed the way you view some of these prospects? And the way I've come around on it, and we've talked to Nick about this before, but James Lipford and Chris Blanco both answered questions about this, is that it's really probably an asset for the pros. Not so much for college coaches, but an asset for the – actually, well, yeah, it was an asset for Indiana this year. Here's James Lipford, who he spoke more on the transfer portal side of things. Then we'll get to Blanco, who talked about the NIL side of things.
I think it's, for us, evaluating it, it's been a positive thing. Now, I don't come from we don't come from a place of the college coaches and that world that has to deal with the everyday transactional nature of it. But from an evaluation standpoint, when players have been at multiple schools, and it's a whole nother group of people you can ask them about how are they on a daily basis, because that's honestly, not to speak for our group, but that's what we're curious about. How are they every single day? Are they consistent? How do they work? How do they show passion for ball? So at the end of the day, we're trying to find that out, players A through Z. And so when you have, hey, he left school A, went to school B, we can talk to both schools, see if the information matches up. If it doesn't, okay, where's the gap? And then, just on player-by-player basis, it's a little window into like how they make decisions, what's important to them. Really not worried about the NIL side of it. We don't get into that a whole lot. But the actual transferring, what was the reason for it? It's not a bad thing. 10 years ago might have been a different conversation, but these guys transfer and we don't hold it against anyone. We just want to know what their DNA is, what they're made of, and ultimately what will they be as a Houston Texan if we draft them. That's what we're just in search of.
Yeah, and I think 10 years ago is probably the right timeline. It used to be a big deal if a guy transferred. There was a natural stigma attached to him. You need to be loyal to your alma mater. Now, I don't even know. Half these guys, I don't know where their allegiance to which team would be. They've been in 3 teams, whatever. So I don't worry about it. I think everything that we were talking about earlier with the Texans valuing the input from coaches like Matt Campbell, when you all of a sudden now have a couple different coaching staffs. Take the case of Woody Marks, between Mississippi State and USC, probably had really good reports out of both those places about the way the guy operates. So you get that many more people, more of a chance that somebody personally at one of those schools who's going to give you the straight scoop and not just hope that you read between the lines about whether a guy's a bum or not. I think that's very, very valuable. The other thing, too, is when we talk about interviewing the players, man, anybody who's ever interviewed people to hire prospects or what have you, we're not doing the ZipRecruiter ad anymore, or at least not this week. If you're interviewing people, you know how you can be duped in an interview. And some guys, sometimes the cruel irony is the people that have had the most issues get the most experience at giving the answers that people want to hear. So they can nail the interview. They can tell you exactly how, like, oh yeah, those troubles are in the past, and now I'm on a straight and narrow path, and I do things the right way. You can tell a lot more by the head coach that tells you, like, no, this guy was late to a meeting before the bowl game, his final year. And it gives you that many more resources. Blanco, as later on, Adolphus asked a question where he sounded like a guy who's more my age that might say, like, all right, but seriously, these guys transferring, you got some character issues there potentially, don't you? That's not how he asked it, but that's the way, in my mind, the grumpy old man like myself would ask.
I'd say with NIL, to Lip's point, to Nick was talking about, it's another data point for us to understand like who they are, what motivates them. And really, it allows us to see how they're going to be as a professional, because that's really a glimpse into a professional mindset.
So again, he's speaking about the NIL part of it and the money part of it.
As we all know, money, it is a factor in some of these decisions that are being made. And for players that are able to handle themselves very well when money comes into play, as long as their motivation stays true to football and everything's grounded in the football game and they're making good decisions, then to us, it's a good data point. And on the flip side, if they give us evidence where it's like maybe they're not handling it as well as maybe as they can, what's the reason behind it? Is it a maturity reason? Is it because they don't have access to the right resources? And for us, as we evaluate the players, it's really about understanding, one, where they're coming from and how they can integrate into our program. So the more data we have on them, whether it's NIL or something else, we want to know so that we can make the determination if they can have success, with the Houston Texans.
Yeah. And one time I was talking about this previously, and I think the way I framed it, I didn't frame it correctly, because one of you guys in the comments made the point that, like, hey, lots of great NFL players have mismanaged their money. Yeah. I don't worry as much about whether they, which index funds they're in or anything like that. I think from a football standpoint, it's nice now that you can see guys that have had to handle playing football well, getting more than just a bunch of $100 handshakes from the alumni. I mean, some of these guys are making most of the good players are making well into the six figures. So you can see, did they continue to keep the main thing? Did they continue to conduct themselves like the professional football players that they are now in college football? So that used to be way more of a crapshoot than it used to be. You just didn't know how a guy who's never had money is going to react and to respond to all of a sudden having 2 commas in his bank account balance. It's a mind-blowing thing. And now these guys have already been through that. And I'm sure there's a bunch of guys that are probably on the Texans right now that maybe initially didn't respond to it well, but figured it out. And all of a sudden, like, that's a hurdle that those guys have gone through, that you don't have to worry about them adapting to on the next level. Now, when it comes to, referencing what James Lipford said earlier, this doesn't mean that college coaches are in love with it or think it's a great thing or anything. I'm sure it's just a mess trying to wrangle all of these different personalities and young men, 18-year-olds having this amount of cash. That ain't my problem, all right? Sorry. The Aggies, the Longhorns, you guys can worry about that. I just like that those guys are going through those growing pains with their colleges, and they're getting they're getting more of an education at a lot of institutions than they were in anything, in any matter or any subject up until now. They've learned the cold hard realities of dealing with 18 family members who think they need a handout all of a sudden. Remember, we promised when we were in high school they were going to take care of each other. You remember that? I was like, dude, that was like 3 months ago. Remember? Yeah. Last one, and this is interesting. I think Landry asked a question about how they came to make the trade up for Will Anderson. Landry is asking a question about just having draft picks in close proximity like they do this year between number 28 overall and number 38 overall. I cut out the portion where Nick is talking about just coming to the decision that, all right, yep, we're going to draft CJ and then we're going to trade up for Will Anderson.
Yeah, the spots probably more just coincidence more than anything else, but speaking to the process, I would say, as we went through it as a staff collectively, and the great thing about how we do it, we put a lot of time between, let's call it August until December. It's very scout-centric, scout-focused. So we let the road scouts, college directors, John, Zeke, Lip, Chris, whomever, do their work, grade the player. Here's what we think of the player. Okay, and then the next layer, call it February, March, kind of go through the same process with the coaches, kind of get their lens. How do they see it? D'Amico obviously goes through his process. So we kind of arrived at the same endpoint where we basically said, look, these are 2 of the best players in the draft. If we have an opportunity to add them to our team, it's probably something at least worth considering or thinking about. Okay, then you start to put the wheels in motion. All right, as you get a little bit closer, you start to say, what's it going to take to get to that point? What's the cost associated with it? Kind of going back to the original question about moving. So once you kind of have an idea of what that looks like, then ultimately you make a decision. Okay, yeah, we're interested in doing it. We're okay with it. Or you know what? It doesn't make as much sense. And we're going to do something else. So again, there's risk reward, there's cost benefit analysis that we go through. So in those conversations, we're pretty, I would say, fluid. The week of the draft, we kind of said, all right, here's what it looks like. Here potentially are our options. Are you good with this? Great. Talk about it as a staff. Hey, what do you guys think? Because they might have a different perspective and a different lens. I think the one thing about how we do it, we take a little bit of a democratic approach where we listen. We try to listen to a lot of ideas and we talk through it. I mean, matter of fact, we had a meeting on Friday where we kind of went through the whole board, and it was like, hey, what do you guys think? Well, okay, we moved this player. Here's the reason why. Okay, does anybody else have a thought? You don't want to make sure we have a variety of opinions that we've gathered. We're not looking for necessarily groupthink. We're just trying to, is there something we're missing here before we ultimately make the decision? And I would say, just going back to your original question with those two players, we talked about it and we felt, you know what, in the end, it's worth whatever we need to do to get to that point, which is why we made the decision that we did.
So the thing I like about that was, one, just the collaboration and kind of just, again, checking your blind spots, checking with everybody. All right, is this how we really feel? And it's a lot like, it feels a lot like courtship and deciding whether you want to marry somebody or not. I'll make the obvious analogy here, which was Mark Twain when he courted his future wife. Mark Twain, I think he was in his 30s at the time, had never been one to settle down and just kind of tramping around all over America and Europe and everything and writing about it. But he met the woman that he wanted to marry, and he ended up writing her after getting refused twice. It proposed to her twice. She said no. He wrote her a letter every day for 200 days, and he went all in. That's a little bit how I think Will Anderson was. I think Will Anderson was a guy that they looked at and thought, you know what, we're going to go all in. Because one thing I admire about Nick and good GMs when they have an approach to the draft where they don't fall in love with prospects. They're their numbers on a board. You set aside all of the emotion and whatever personal attachment you feel, and you're just making transactions until you meet the right one. And then you write 200 love letters in 200 days. Like, that's when you go all in. And they went all in. But to take it back to the courtship, analogy, they checked with their family. They checked with everybody. Like, oh, it's cool, right? Yeah, everybody's telling me we should go for this. That's how it felt with Will Anderson. A love story for the ages. This is the Believe in Texans podcast. I'll probably do like 2 more episodes. I want to get into the best player available versus drafting for need dynamic, because Nick always gives some really crafty answers about all of that, but it's interesting, especially for the draft nerds. We can get into that later this week. And Sean and I will have him on Sports Radio 610. It's 7:30 a.m. Central on Wednesday. Everybody have a great one. If you're listening on Apple, please leave a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. And everybody have a great one. Thanks to FanDuel for sponsoring the Believe in Texans podcast.